It's 3 a.m. You're driving a semi-truck north on Highway 85, the road stretching endlessly toward the Texas border. Behind you is a sealed container loaded with $2 million worth of high-end electronics, smartphones, servers, the physical embodiment of the modern global economy. To your right, illuminated by floodlights, skeletal steel frames rise out of the desert. A brand new gigafactory. Fresh concrete. Fresh money. A symbol of Mexico's future, of foreign capital pouring in, of factories humming, of an industrial awakening, decades in the making. Then you check your rearview mirror. A black pickup truck with no license plates is riding your bumper, headlights flashing. You don't need to see the faces inside. You already know who they are. You already know what they want. And in that instant, you are staring at the two faces of Mexico's economy. On one side, there is the Aztec tiger, a manufacturing juggernaut, absorbing billions in foreign investment, overtaking China as America's top trading partner and turning the peso from a joke into one of the strongest emerging market currencies on earth. On the other side, there is a shadow economy so powerful, so violent, and so deeply embedded that economists struggle to measure Mexico's GDP without implicitly accounting for it. An economy where cartels act like multinational corporations, where extortion functions like a tax system, and where the rule of law competes with the rule of force. This is the paradox of modern Mexico. It's Mexico on the verge of becoming the industrial backbone of North America, the country that finally breaks the world income trap and rises into the ranks of true economic powers. Or is it a ticking time bomb where corruption, cartel governance, and institutional decay will eventually overwhelm the boom? To answer that question, we need to stop reading the tourist brochure. We need to look at the books. Because Mexico's economy today is not a simple success story or a simple failure. It is a high-speed collision between global capital and local reality, and the outcome is still undecided. For most of the last century, Mexico lived in the shadow of missed potential. It was always described as a country with everything it needed to succeed: a massive population, natural resources, proximity to the largest consumer market on earth. And yet, it never quite made the leap. Growth came in bursts, then stalled. Crises arrived in waves: 1982, 1994, 2008, each time resetting progress. By the 2010s, Mexico had settled into an uncomfortable equilibrium: stable but unequal, industrial but informal, modern on the surface, fragile underneath. Then the world changed. The global economy that had defined the last 30 years, cheap production in China, shipped across oceans to American consumers, began to fracture. First came trade wars, then came pandemics. Then came the realization that efficiency without resilience is a liability. In boardrooms from New York to Berlin, executives reached the same conclusion: putting your entire supply chain on the other side of the planet in a geopolitical rival was no longer clever. It was reckless. And that's when Mexico re-entered the conversation. Not as a developing economy, not as a low-cost alternative, but as a strategic necessity. Mexico is next door. It has railroads, highways, ports, and a young workforce. It is embedded in the USMCA trade agreement, giving it tariff-free access to the American market. And unlike Southeast Asia, it doesn't require a ship to cross an ocean. The result was a gold rush. Factories began rising across northern Mexico: automotive plants, aerospace facilities, electronics assembly lines. Even Chinese companies joined the rush, not out of love for Mexico, but out of pragmatism. Build in China, face tariffs. Build in Mexico, and suddenly your product is North American. By late 2024, something historic happened. For the first time in over 2 decades, the United States imported more goods from Mexico than from China. Not toys, not cheap plastics, high-end manufacturing. Electric vehicles, engines, precision components. This surge in foreign direct investment triggered what economists started calling the super peso. For decades, the Mexican peso was the punching bag of emerging markets, volatile, weak, easily shaken by global shocks. But suddenly, it began to strengthen. Against all expectations, it appreciated sharply in 2023 and held firm through 2024. On paper, this looked like a miracle. A rising currency, rising exports, rising investment. The Aztec tiger was back. But here's the problem with miracles. They often hide stress fractures. While capital rushed in, the foundations beneath it began to creak. Mexico's infrastructure, long neglected, underfunded, and politicized, struggled to keep up. Power grids flickered. Water systems ran dry. In industrial hubs like Monterrey, factories were ready to produce, but there wasn't enough electricity to run them reliably. The state-controlled energy system, protected and expanded under recent administrations, made it difficult for companies to generate their own renewable power and water. In recent years, entire neighborhoods in northern cities faced drought conditions so severe that taps ran dry, while nearby industrial parks consumed millions of liters a day. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of Mexico's boom. The world wants to give Mexico its money. But money alone does not build states. Without electricity, factories are just metal shells. Without water, industrial parks become monuments to poor planning. Mexico has the golden ticket, but if it doesn't fix the grid and the pipes, that ticket comes with an expiration date. And even if every factory runs perfectly, there is another question that refuses to go away. What happens when economic growth collides with a shadow system powerful enough to tax, terrorize, and govern entire regions? Because beneath the gleaming factories and rising export numbers lies an economy that doesn't appear in official charts but shapes daily life for millions. An economy with its own enforcement arm, its own revenue streams, and its own brutal efficiency. To understand Mexico's future, we have to confront that shadow directly. And that's where the story turns dark. To understand why Mexico suddenly matters so much, you have to zoom out. For 30 years, the global economy ran on a single assumption. China was the factory of the world. Labor was cheap, logistics were predictable, and geopolitics, while tense, felt manageable. Then that assumption collapsed. First came the trade war. Tariffs turned spreadsheets red overnight. Then came COVID. Ports froze. Ships waited. Entire supply chains snapped like brittle glass. Then came something even more unsettling for CEOs. The realization that production was, just far away. It was politically exposed. Beijing locked down a city, factories stopped. If Taiwan flared, everything stopped. Suddenly, efficiency didn't matter as much as proximity. This shift has a name: nearshoring. And no country on earth was better positioned to benefit from it than Mexico. Mexico is not just close to the United States. It is structurally embedded in the North American economy. Rail lines cross the border daily. Trucks move seamlessly between factories in Nuevo León and warehouses in Texas. And under the USMCA trade agreement, goods built in Mexico enter the U.S. market tariff-free. For global corporations, this wasn't a strategic pivot. It was an escape hatch. By 2024, the numbers confirmed what factory cranes had already made obvious. Mexico officially overtook China as the largest exporter to the United States. For the first time in more than 2 decades, America bought more from its southern neighbor than from the Asian giant. This wasn't about cheap toys or low-end textiles. This was high-value manufacturing. Automotive plants multiplied across northern states. Tesla announced plans for a massive gigafactory in Nuevo León. BMW and Audi expanded operations. Aerospace clusters deepened. Even Chinese firms like BYD joined the rush not to challenge the system, but to exploit it. Here's the trick. If a Chinese company builds an electric vehicle in China and ships it to the US, it gets hit with tariffs. If that same company builds the car in Mexico, under USMCA rules, it becomes a North American product. Same company, same capital, different passport. That single legal distinction unlocked billions. Foreign direct investment poured in, and with it came something few expected. The peso surged. For decades, the Mexican peso had been the symbol of emerging market fragility. Devaluations, crises, volatility. It was the currency traders loved too short. Then suddenly, it wasn't. In 2023, the peso appreciated sharply against the dollar, outperforming most global currencies. Analysts began calling it the super peso. Through much of 2024, it held its ground, even as inflation, war, and recession fears battered markets elsewhere. On the surface, this looked like success. A strong currency means confidence. Confidence attracts capital. Capital fuels growth, but currencies, like economies, can grow too strong for their own good. Because while investors were celebrating, Mexico's infrastructure was quietly screaming. Factories don't just need workers, need power, they need water. And Mexico is running short on both. The electrical grid has been underfunded for years. Maintenance was deferred. Expansion lagged behind demand. At the same time, recent governments doubled down on state control over energy, limiting private investment, especially in renewables. The result is a paradox. Mexico is attracting some of the world's most advanced manufacturing, including electric vehicles and data-heavy industries, while relying on a grid that flickers like a horror movie hallway. There are factories ready to produce that cannot run at full capacity because electricity supply is unstable. And then there is water. Ask anyone in Monterrey. In recent years, droughts became so severe that residential taps ran dry. People lined up for water trucks. Rationing became normal. All while nearby industrial parks consumed millions of liters a day. This is the nearshoring contradiction in its purest form. Mexico has the golden ticket the world wants to build here. But unless Mexico upgrades its power grid and secures long-term water infrastructure, that boom has a ceiling. You cannot industrialize on scarcity. And this brings us to the deeper historical context. Mexico has been here before. In the 1960s and 70s, it pursued import substitution, industrialization, building domestic industry behind protectionist walls. Growth surged. Then inefficiency set in. Debt exploded. The model collapsed in the 1980s. In the 1990s, NAFTA arrived. Manufacturing surged again. Exports boomed. But wages stagnated. Informality persisted. Growth never fully translated into broad prosperity. Now, nearshoring is the third act. Another chance. But the difference this time is speed. Capital is moving faster than institutions can adapt. Factories are rising faster than infrastructure can support them. And expectations are rising faster than living standards. That gap between what Mexico looks like on investor decks and what it feels like on the ground is where instability grows. Because while the Aztec tiger is flexing its muscles, there is another force operating beneath the surface. One that doesn't care about trade agreements, doesn't wait for permits, and doesn't appear in official statistics, at least not cleanly. An economy that employs more people than some of Mexico's largest corporations. An economy that taxes without legislation and enforces without courts. An economy that functions in the shadows but props up entire regions. To understand whether Mexico's boom is real or fragile, we have to turn off the lights and look directly at the shadow GDP. Now turn off the lights. Because the next part of Mexico's economy does not appear cleanly in World Bank charts or IMF tables, at least not in the way you'd expect. It exists in footnotes, in estimates, in phrases like informal sector and non-state actors. But for millions of Mexicans, it is not abstract. It is daily life. If you still imagine Mexican cartels as men in boots moving white powder across desert roads, you are living in the 1990s. Today's cartels look less like gangs and more like diversified conglomerates, vertically integrated, geographically distributed, and brutally efficient. They traffic drugs, yes. But that is no longer the core of the business. They extort. They control logistics routes. They sell stolen fuel. They regulate agriculture. They launder money through construction, retail, and real estate. And most importantly, they employ people. A study published in Science in 2023 landed like a grenade in economic circles. It estimated that organized crime in Mexico is the fifth largest employer in the country. Let that sink in. Larger than some of the nation's most recognizable corporations. Roughly 175,000 people on the payroll, and that's a conservative estimate. When you include contractors, suppliers, and coerced collaborators, the real number swells further. This is not a criminal fringe. It is a parallel labor market, and its economic impact goes far beyond violence. Economists have a name for the mechanism that connects cartels to everyday prices: the floor tax extortion. Imagine you run a small business, a taco stand, trucking firm, a lemon orchard in Michoacan. Every week, someone arrives to collect a security fee. Pay it, and you operate. Refuse, and your options narrow fast. This is not theoretical. It functions like a private tax system enforced with fear instead of courts. The cost gets passed on. Food prices rise. Construction costs rise. Transport becomes more expensive. Take avocados, the symbol of modern Mexican agriculture. In states like Michoacan, cartel groups influence planting cycles, control packing houses, and skim every truckload. When avocado prices spike in New York or Los Angeles, it's not always weather or demand. Sometimes it's a cartel dispute that closed a highway. And it doesn't stop with agriculture. Fuel theft, known as huachicol, became so widespread that losses at the state oil company ran into billions of dollars annually. Stolen fuel was sold back into the legitimate economy. Gas stations, transport firms, construction companies. At that point, the distinction between legal and illegal money stops being clear. It becomes blended. Here's the dark paradox. In some regions, this shadow money keeps the local economy alive. When a cartel leader builds a mansion, local contractors get paid. When gunmen receive salaries, they buy trucks, clothes, food, beer. Entire towns depend on this circulation. Remove it overnight, and those towns collapse. This is not a defense of the system. It's a diagnosis. The parasite has become load-bearing. The Institute for Economics and Peace estimates that the economic cost of violence in Mexico is equivalent to 18 to 20% of GDP. Imagine losing 1/5 of your economy every year, not to recession, but to fear, inefficiency, and deadweight loss. You can build all the gigafactories you want. You can attract Tesla, BMW, and BYD. But if managers fear kidnapping on the drive to work, your economy has a glass ceiling. And that ceiling is institutional. Which brings us to the next contradiction. Because while the shadow economy drains value from below, Mexico is also carrying a massive, visible liability above. A relic of the 20th century. A company so large, so indebted, and so politically sensitive that it warps the entire fiscal system around it. If you want to understand why Wall Street gets nervous about Mexico, why analysts hedge every optimistic forecast, you have to meet the zombie in the room. A dinosaur with a trillion peso shadow. Its name is Pemex, and it is the most indebted oil company on earth. For decades, Pemex was the pride of the nation, proof that Mexico controlled its own resources. It funded schools, hospitals, highways. It was treated as a national champion. But champions can rot. Today, Pemex carries roughly $100 billion USD in debt, more than the GDP of several countries. It owes so much money that rating agencies have pushed its bonds into junk territory. How did this happen? First, the state taxed it to death. Instead of allowing Pemex to reinvest profits into exploration, maintenance, and modernization, governments siphoned off revenue to plug budget holes. The company became an ATM that was never refilled. Second, inefficiency and corruption. Pemex is bloated, overstaffed, politicized. Contracts awarded through networks of loyalty rather than competence. While global oil majors became lean and technologically advanced, Pemex calcified. And then came the decision that shocked markets. Rather than reforming or downsizing Pemex or pivoting toward energy diversification, the government chose to double down. Billions in public funds were poured into propping it up. A massive new refinery was built, over budget and behind schedule. All of this in a world racing toward electrification and renewables. Here is the kicker. The Mexican government has effectively guaranteed Pemex's debt. If Pemex fails, the state absorbs the shock. That means every optimistic projection about Mexico's fiscal future carries a footnote. Assuming Pemex does not implode. It is too big to fail, and too broken to fix easily. So now Mexico stands in a strange position. On one side, nearshoring, manufacturing, foreign capital, and a strong currency. On the other, a shadow tax system run by cartels and a state oil company bleeding money. This is not a clean boom. It is a tension. And that tension doesn't just show up in balance sheets. It shows up in migration. Because when domestic opportunity is uneven, people vote with their feet. And the next pillar of Mexico's economy doesn't come from factories or oil fields. It comes from wallets opened thousands of miles away. Dollars wired home every month. A safety net built not by the state, but by absence. That is where we go next. Let's shift our focus. from oil flowing out of the ground to money flowing in through Western Union. If I told you that Mexico's most reliable economic safety net, ISN, a government program, a sovereign fund, or a central bank policy, but a construction worker named Juan laying drywall in Phoenix, Arizona, you might laugh. But that worker is holding up a significant part of the Mexican economy. Welcome to the remittance economy. In 2023 and 2024, Mexicans living abroad sent home over $60 billion a year. That's more than Mexico earns from agricultural exports. In some years, it rivals oil revenue. Politicians love these numbers. Former presidents praised migrants as heroes. Morning press conferences celebrated new records. Charts pointed upward. But economists see something else. Celebrating record remittances is like a hospital celebrating record ICU admissions. It's data, but it signals distress. High remittances mean the domestic economy cannot provide enough stable, well-paying jobs for its own people. It means opportunity still lives on the other side of the border. For millions of young Mexicans, the dream is not to build the Aztec tiger. The dream is to leave it. Picture a talented engineering graduate in Oaxaca. At home, wages are low. Opportunities are scarce. The informal economy dominates. Cartels operate openly. Extortion is routine. Across the border, the same skills earn 10 times more. Enough to send money home. Enough to build a house. Enough to support an entire family. So people leave, and when they do, dollars flood back. Here's the cruel irony. Those dollars strengthen the peso, feeding the super peso phenomenon. And a stronger peso makes Mexican exports more expensive and tourism less competitive. A tourist from New York realizes their vacation now costs 20% more than it did 2 years ago. Maybe they go to Thailand instead. The very money that keeps families afloat also quietly erodes competitiveness. This is another form of Dutch disease, not driven by oil, but by migration. Mexico is exporting its most valuable resource, human capital. And while the nearshoring boom concentrates investment in the north, this migration dynamic deepens a divide that has existed for generations. Mexico is not one economy, it is two. The north, Nuevo León, Baja California, Chihuahua is industrial, export-oriented, and tightly integrated with the United States. Factories hum, wages are higher. Infrastructure, while strained, exists. Drop someone from Detroit into Monterrey, and they would recognize the rhythm. Strip malls, logistics hubs, assembly lines. This is the Mexico global capital sees. Then there is the South Chiapas, Oaxaca, Guerrero. Culturally rich, environmentally diverse, economically isolated. Here, poverty rates are double or triple those in the north. Informality dominates. Cash rules, benefits don't exist. For decades, growth passed these regions by. Recent administrations tried to close this gap with massive state-led projects, highways, refineries, and the most controversial of all, the Maya train. The vision was ambitious. A tourist rail loop cutting through the jungle, pulling money from Cancun deep into the interior. The reality has been divisive. Environmentalists warn of irreversible damage to ecosystems and underground water systems. Economists question the ballooning cost from $8 billion to nearly $30 and whether it will ever generate returns. The North complains it funds projects that don't benefit it. The South says it's been ignored for a century and deserves its turn. This tension simmers beneath every growth statistic. You cannot be a superpower if half your country is sprinting and the other half is trapped. And now, layered on top of this internal divide, comes an external clock, a deadline. July 2026. That's when the USMCA trade agreement faces its first major review, a sunset clause that can trigger renegotiation or termination. This matters more than any election. Mexico's entire nearshoring pitch depends on tariff-free access to the U.S. market. Lose that, and factories close. Capital leaves. The peso collapses. Here's the twist. A significant share of Mexico's export growth is indirectly Chinese. It's called transshipment. Parts arrive from China. Minimal assembly happens in Mexico. The finished product crosses into the U.S. labeled Made in North America. Washington has noticed. Mexico's trade deficit with China exploded to around $120 billion in 2024. Both U.S. political parties are furious. The risk is clear. In 2026, American negotiators may say, "Kick China out of your factories, or you're out of our market." For Mexico, that's existential. The Aztec tiger doesn't just need capital, it needs access. And while this geopolitical tension builds, another structural trap tightens. More than half of Mexico's workforce operates informally. No taxes, no benefits, no pensions. Two brothers illustrate the problem. Carlos works at a Ford plant. He pays taxes. He follows the rules. The state takes 30% of his income. Juan runs a taco stand and sells gray market electronics. He earns similar money, sometimes more. He pays nothing. In the short term, Juan looks smart. In the long term, the system breaks. Because when 55% of workers don't pay taxes, the government remains permanently broke. Mexico collects roughly 16 to 17% of GDP in taxes, among the lowest in the OECD. Low revenue means poor services. Poor services mean people refuse to pay taxes. The loop repeats. This also caps productivity. Informal businesses can't scale. They can't access credit. They can't export. They remain micro-enterprises forever. Mexico ends up with a Ferrari engine in the North Advanced Manufacturing. Aerospace, EVs, attached to bicycle wheels made of street vendors and cash-only firms. You can rev that engine all you want. You won't win the race. And all of this leads to the question foreign investors care about most. Not wages, not location, not even cartels. The rule of law. Because certainty is more valuable than profit. And in Mexico, certainty is fragile. Which brings us to the final reckoning. Because if the rules keep changing, if courts become political, contracts become optional, and presidents can cancel billion-dollar projects on a whim, capital will not argue. It will leave Souza. Mexico's boom will not collapse dramatically. It will simply move on to Vietnam, to India, to the next, almost. That's the cliff Mexico is approaching. And what happens next depends on whether the state can become stronger than the shadows beneath it. So let's zoom all the way out. Strip away the headlines, the stock charts, the political slogans, the social media hot takes. What is the real truth about Mexico's economy? It is a country standing on a razor's edge. On one side, Mexico is living through the opportunity of the century. Global geopolitics has handed it a winning lottery ticket. The United States needs a manufacturing partner that is not China. Supply chains are being rebuilt closer to home. Capital is searching for safety, speed, and proximity. Mexico has all three. It has geography no other country can replicate. It has a young workforce. It has industrial depth built over decades. It has trade agreements that open the world's richest consumer market. The Aztec tiger is real. It is not hype. It is visible in export numbers, factory floors, and currency markets. Mexico today is far closer to becoming a true economic power than it has ever been in modern history. But on the other side of the blade sit the anchors, a shadow economy that taxes nearly a fifth of GDP through fear and violence, cartels that function as parallel governments in entire regions, a state oil company so indebted it threatens national finances, a judicial system sliding toward politicization at the exact moment certainty is needed most, an informal economy that traps half the workforce outside productivity and protection, a water and energy system straining under growth it wasn't designed to handle. Mexico is, in many ways, the luckiest unlucky country on earth. It keeps surviving despite systems that seem engineered to hold it back. And history is unforgiving to countries that mistake survival for success. The next 3 years matter more than the last 30. Between now and the 2026 USMCA review, Mexico faces a series of quiet, irreversible decisions. Will it formalize its economy or continue tolerating a tax-free majority that starves the state? Will it strengthen the rule of law or turn courts into political instruments? Will it confront cartel power or continue managing violence rather than ending it? Will it fix water and energy infrastructure or let scarcity cap growth? Will it clarify its position between the United States and China or try to play both sides until one walks away? These are not ideological questions. They are structural ones, because economies don't fail when growth slows. They fail when institutions stop working. Mexico's danger is not collapse. It is stagnation, the quiet kind, the kind where factories stop expanding, where capital pauses instead of flees, where talented people keep leaving, where growth becomes something that almost happens. A country of almost. Almost rich, almost safe, almost fair, almost powerful. We've seen this movie before. In the 1920s, countries rode credit booms believing prosperity was permanent until 1929 reminded them that foundations matter more than momentum. In 2008, global finance learned that growth built on fragility collapses faster than anyone expects. And today, in the mid-2020s, Mexico is being tested by the same timeless question. Can opportunity outrun institutional weakness, or does weakness always catch up? Mexico's story is not finished. It can still choose discipline over convenience, law over loyalty, investment over patronage, long-term stability over short-term politics. If it does, Mexico doesn't just become a manufacturing hub. It becomes a pillar of the North American economy, not as a cheap alternative, but as an equal. If it doesn't, the Aztec tiger doesn't die. It limps, and the world moves on. Factories go elsewhere, capital finds safer ground, and Mexico returns to its old position, not poor enough to collapse, not strong enough to lead. The tragedy of potential. So now, the question isn't academic, it's personal. If you were a CEO deciding where to build your next factory, would you choose Mexico? If you were a young Mexican engineer, would you stay or would you leave? If you were in charge of the country, would you fix the system and risk losing power? Or ride the boom and hope the bill never comes due? Because the real truth about Mexico's economy is this: the future is not being decided by growth rates. It's being decided by choices. And those choices are running out of time.